In the forgotten valleys of Spokane, where the skies hang heavy with old prayers and broken promises, there ran a Mustang the color of smoke, wild, fierce, and too proud to bow. No hand could touch him, no cage could tame him, until one silent soul, a soldier with scars no one could see, dared to stand before him, not with a whip, but with a wounded heart. What happened next would defy everything they thought they knew about healing, hope, and the power of simply staying. This is the story of Ash and the man he chose to believe in. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. The skies over Spokane, Washington, were a churning cauldron of ash and lead, the clouds sagging low and heavy as if carrying the weight of forgotten storms. A biting wind howled through the sandstone cliffs, tugging at the dry grasses and sending dust devils dancing across the empty high plains. It was the kind of afternoon where the land seemed to hold its breath, a world teetering on the brink of something inevitable. Far below the jagged ridges, a herd of wild mustangs streaked through the labyrinth of rocky gullies. At the head of the thundering procession was Ash, a Mustang unlike any other. Ash was a smoke-colored stallion, his coat a perfect swirl of silver and charcoal, as if he had galloped straight out of a dying fire. His mane, dark as volcanic glass, whipped violently in the gale. Ash was young, no more than 6 years old, but carried himself with the seasoned authority of a war general. His build was compact yet powerful, with rippling muscles and a glint of defiance in his storm-gray eyes. Ash had always been a creature of instinct sharpened by hardship. Born during one of the harshest winters Spokane had seen in decades, he survived by leading his small herd with cunning rather than brute force. Where other stallions charged at danger, Ash learned to maneuver, outwit, and endure. Perhaps it was that same instinct that had kept him free for so long. Until today. Above them, a dull thudding noise began to pulse through the sky. The shriek of a helicopter blade broke the somber hush, slicing through the clouds like a blade through silk. The herd panicked instantly. Foals stumbled over loose rocks, mares whinnied in frantic calls. Ash slowed only for a heartbeat, casting a fierce glance upward. His ears pinned flat against his skull, nostrils flaring with fury. He knew what was coming. The helicopter veered lower, its deafening roar corralling the Mustangs into a tightening spiral. From behind the cliffs, men on ATVs emerged, wranglers clad in dust-streaked denim and leather, their faces hardened and impassive. One of them, Mac Turner, led the ground team. Mac was in his early 40s, a broad-shouldered man with pockmarked skin and eyes like sun-bleached stones. Known for his ruthless efficiency, he viewed the roundups as necessary work, not cruelty, just business. His philosophy was simple: get the wild ones in, get them sold, no time for sentimentality. Mac barked orders into a handheld radio, his voice terse and cold. Around him, younger wranglers moved with a rehearsed brutality. Whips cracked the air like gunshots, and metal panels were slammed into place along the narrow canyon's exits. Ash dodged the first traps expertly, leading his herd in a breathtaking sprint across the canyon floor. He darted between boulders, leapt dry creek beds, and skidded across loose shale with a nimbleness that left even the helicopter pilot struggling to keep up. Behind him, the younger Mustangs struggled to match his speed. One spindly foal, barely past weaning, tripped over a hidden rut and went sprawling, dust cloaking its trembling form. Ash hesitated, looking back. His loyalty warred against his survival instincts. In the end, nature's harsh rule prevailed. Survival of the strong. With a guttural snort, Ash pushed forward, angling toward a gap in the cliffs that might offer escape. But Mac had anticipated that move. A wall of portable fencing rose up ahead, camouflaged in desert hues. Two wranglers whooped triumphantly, swinging the gates shut with a resonant clang just as Ash and the front runners reached the bottleneck. Ash reared, hooves lashing the air. His scream, raw, guttural, heart-wrenching, echoed off the canyon walls. Dust churned in suffocating waves as the herd crashed against the barriers, seeking any way out. Mares shielded their foals with their bodies. Stallions snapped at the panels in impotent rage. Ash, maddened by betrayal, lunged again and again at the makeshift pens. Blood welled along his shins where he struck steel. His coat, once a ghostly shimmer, now glistened with sweat and red smears. Mac watched from a safe distance, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. That one, he said, jerking a thumb toward Ash. "Mark him. Dangerous stock. He's no good for open adoption. Too much fire." Another wrangler, Sarah Langley, dutifully scribbled on a clipboard. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and wiry with freckles scattered across her sun-tanned skin like flecks of gold. Though physically lean and seemingly cheerful, Sarah had learned the hard way not to get attached. Years earlier, she had volunteered at a rescue that failed spectacularly when poorly trained horses caused several accidents. Since then, she'd armored herself with a thick layer of detached professionalism. "Noted," she muttered, flashing a brief, hollow smile that never quite reached her amber eyes. As the sun dipped behind the distant ridges, the temperature dropped swiftly. The wind sharpened into icy fingers, plucking at loose hair and setting the canvas tarps flapping over the pens. Dust hung heavy in the air, and every crevice seemed to whistle with the mournful sound of a lost spirit. The helicopters peeled away toward the horizon, their work done. All that remained was the heavy breathing of exhausted horses and the occasional rattle of chains being secured. Ash stood at the center of the holding pen, legs braced wide, head high, despite the trickle of blood from his forehead. He looked less like a defeated animal and more like a king awaiting execution. As Sarah slapped a fluorescent orange tag on the pen's gate, BLM Special Category Dangerous, she found herself pausing just for a second to meet Ash's gaze. There was no madness there. No fear even, only a smoldering, bottomless rage, a defiance that no cage, no whip, no label could extinguish. Sarah quickly looked away, heart hammering unexpectedly in her chest. The wind screamed louder through the canyons as night fell, carrying with it the scent of blood, sweat, and a future unwritten. Ash lowered his head slowly, his breath coiling into mist before vanishing into the bitter Spokane night. The early morning light in Wenatchee, Washington, filtered through the blinds of a cramped one-bedroom apartment, casting pale lines across the worn wooden floor. The city, nestled between the Columbia River and the rugged Cascade Mountains, had long since shaken off the dust of its orchard town roots and embraced a quieter, almost hidden existence. But for Jonah McCrae, peace was a cruel illusion. Jonah, 28, stood in the small kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the counter as he stared at the empty coffee pot. His reflection glared back at him from the darkened microwave door. A lean figure, tall and wiry, with sandy blonde hair cropped close to his skull. His jawline was sharp, almost severe. And his blue-gray eyes, once lively, now seemed perpetually shadowed by exhaustion. A thick scar, a thin, almost elegant line ran from behind his left ear down to the base of his neck, half hidden by the collar of his hoodie. PTSD was the official name on his medical file. Jonah just called it the beast. He barely slept. When he did, the dreams came. Mortar shells, screaming comrades, the whip crack of sniper bullets splitting the air. Some nights he would wake gasping, the sound of a distant train horn mistaken for a helicopter blade, his hands clutching the bed sheets like a lifeline. Other nights, it was the shrill wail of a passing ambulance that drove him out of bed, heart hammering, palms clammy with remembered fear. At his feet lay Rusty, a 7-year-old Belgian Malinois with a grizzled snout and a perpetual look of quiet alertness. Rusty had served with Jonah overseas, trained for search and rescue missions in urban rubble. The dog was lean, muscular, and scarred across one ear from a roadside bomb blast that had nearly killed them both. Despite his age and slight limp, Rusty's amber eyes missed nothing, always scanning, always ready. The apartment was silent except for the rhythmic thud of Rusty's tail against the floor. Not excited, just steady, a silent reassurance. Jonah dropped a hand down, scratching between Rusty's ears. "Another day, old man," he murmured. "Another fight." The knock at the door was almost imperceptible, but Jonah stiffened immediately. Rusty rose to his feet, ears pricked forward. Jonah crossed the room in 2 strides, peered through the peephole, and exhaled when he recognized the man standing there. Henry McCrae. Henry was a large, broad-shouldered man in his late 60s, his hair gone completely white but still thick, combed back neatly. His face, deeply lined by sun and years of worry, gave the impression of a stone statue carved by time. His green eyes, so much like Jonah's, remained clear and steady. A veterinarian by trade, Henry had spent decades healing horses, dogs, cattle, and more than a few lost souls. Jonah opened the door with a grunt. Henry stepped inside without preamble, carrying the smell of leather and hay with him like a second skin. He wore a battered canvas jacket, jeans, and a heavy pair of boots crusted in dried mud. "You look like hell, boy," Henry said, not unkindly. His voice was low, gravelly, shaped by years of speaking quietly around skittish animals. Jonah shrugged. "Thanks, Uncle Henry. Good to see you, too." Henry surveyed the apartment, the sparse furniture, the peeling wallpaper, the dishes stacked neatly but untouched in the sink. His gaze lingered on Rusty, who wagged his tail once in a slow arc before sitting at Jonah's side like a sentinel. Henry clapped Jonah on the shoulder, a brief, rough gesture of affection. "Come on, then. Pack a bag. I've got something better for you than this." Jonah's brows knit together. "Better?" Henry smiled, a tight curve of the mouth that didn't quite touch his eyes. "Whispering Pines. The ranch. I need an extra hand. Few too many rescues lately. Horses mostly, but they're stubborn, scared, just like some folks I know." Jonah hesitated. The thought of wide-open fields, of silence broken only by the wind and the occasional nicker of a horse, was both comforting and terrifying. "Don't have to talk to anyone," Henry added, sensing his nephew's unease. "No crowds, no sirens, just work, feed, muck stalls, fix some fencing, simple things, things that matter." Rusty whined softly, pressing against Jonah's leg. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the tension coil tighter. "I don't know, Uncle. Henry cut him off gently. "You're Allahun. That's enough." An hour later, Jonah loaded his duffel bag and Rusty into the battered Ford pickup Henry had driven. They rolled out of Wenatchee, past shuttered storefronts and sleepy gas stations, climbing steadily into the foothills. The city fell away behind them, swallowed by mist and memory. Whispering Pines was an old ranch nestled deep in a valley, rimmed by ponderosa pines and jagged cliffs. It had once been a prosperous breeding farm for quarter horses, but in the years since Henry retired, it had transformed into a quiet refuge for lost animals. And, Henry suspected, for lost men too. The house was a sprawling, low-slung structure of weathered wood and fieldstone, its porch sagging slightly but welcoming. Behind it stretched a series of wide paddocks, a red-painted barn, and farther out, open pasture that caught the last rays of the setting sun. Jonah stepped out of the truck and breathed deeply. The air smelled of hay, rain-soaked earth, and the faint tang of pine resin. Rusty leapt down and immediately began sniffing the perimeter, tail wagging cautiously. Henry pointed toward the barn. "You'll bunk there. Apartment over the tack room. Not fancy, but it's clean. Dogs welcome too." Inside the barn, the light was dim and golden, filtering through dusty rafters. Horses shifted in their stalls, some lifting their heads to peer at the newcomers. Their coats gleamed in muted colors, bays, sorrels, the occasional paint. Jonah felt the tightness in his chest ease slightly at the steady, earthy smells of horses and straw. Henry led Jonah to meet Clara Mendoza, the ranch's only other full-time hand. Clara was in her early 40s, with deep brown skin, short-cropped black hair, and strong arms honed from years of manual labor. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her dark eyes quick but kind. Clara had come to Whispering Pines after losing her family ranch to a wildfire years earlier. She spoke little of the past but carried its scars in the wary set of her shoulders. Clara shook Jonah's hand firmly. "Henry said you're good with animals," she said, her voice warm but brisk. "Good. We need more hands that know how to listen." Jonah nodded, grateful for the lack of fanfare. The sun dipped behind the cliffs, casting long purple shadows across the fields. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a coyote yipped, answered by the low rumble of distant thunder. The world felt fragile, poised between storm and stillness. Jonah stood there a moment longer, feeling Rusty press against his leg, Clara's steady presence nearby, Henry's broad figure silhouetted against the barn lights. Maybe, just maybe, there was a place for broken things here after all. Morning in Whispering Pines was a different kind of silence, heavy and vast. The kind that filled your lungs and made you realize how loud your own heart could be. A brittle wind swept across the fields, dragging with it a crispness that hinted at autumn's early arrival. Above the ranch, clouds clung stubbornly to the ridgelines, and the light was filtered into a pale, mournful gold. Jonah McCrae hunched deeper into his flannel jacket as he made his way toward the special holding pens behind the main barn. Rusty trotted alongside him, the aging Malinois moving with a stiff but determined gait, ears flicking at every whisper of the breeze. The air smelled of damp hay, pine sap, and a faint metallic tang, the scent of horses nervous enough to sweat even in the cool morning air. Henry had given him a simple instruction before heading into town. Just check on the new one. No need to do anything, just be there. Jonah hadn't asked questions. It was easier that way. He paused as the special enclosure came into view. A high-walled pen reinforced with heavy wooden beams and steel mesh. A bright warning sign hung on the gate. Caution, aggressive animal. Inside, moving like a shadow against the far wall, was Ash. Ash was even more magnificent in real life than in the blurred photograph Henry had taped to the barn wall. The Mustang's coat was a swirling dance of silver and coal, a living storm cloud. His frame was lean but dense with muscle, built for survival, not show. Small scars, not obvious at first glance, crisscrossed his flanks and legs, silent testimonies to battles fought and won against both nature and man. His mane was wild and tangled, hanging over intelligent eyes that gleamed with a cold, smoldering defiance. The stallion stood rigid, weight shifted onto his haunches, muscles taut like a coiled spring. His ears pinned flat against his skull as Jonah approached the gate. The expression in Ash's eyes was not one of wild panic. It was something harder, older. A deep, weary hatred, like burnt-out embers left in the wake of a wildfire. Rusty gave a low, almost inaudible whine, then lay down at Jonah's feet, eyes fixed warily on the horse. Jonah crouched beside the dog, resting one hand absently on Rusty's head. His instincts screamed caution, but something in the desolate set of Ash's body anchored him there. Jonah didn't call out, didn't click his tongue, didn't reach through the fence like so many others must have done before. He simply sat, the worn boards of the fence pressing against his back, letting the raw weight of his presence settle into the brittle morning air. Ash tossed his head once, sending a ripple through his mane. His hooves shifted on the packed dirt, but he made no move to charge or rear. Instead, he stared, a stare that felt like a physical force, testing Jonah's resolve, peeling back the layers he kept so tightly wound. Jonah exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar knot of tension in his chest loosen just a fraction. He had stood before men who wanted him dead, had felt the crush of explosions that shattered concrete and bone. Yet sitting here, facing this battered Mustang, he felt something deeper. Not fear, but recognition. The wind picked up, hissing through the brittle grass beyond the paddocks. It created a sound like distant whispers, 1,000 voices breathing through the valleys. The sigh of wandering souls who had no place left to go. Jonah closed his eyes for a moment, listening. Somewhere deep in his ribs, something ancient and broken stirred. Footsteps crunched behind him. Jonah turned his head to see Nina Brooks approaching with a bucket of feed in one hand. Nina was the ranch's part-time hand, hired for weekend shifts. She was a wiry woman in her late 20s, with sharp cheekbones and a mess of red curls tied back in a bandana. Her arms were inked with sprawling tattoos, wildflowers, mountain ranges, and a scattering of stars. Nina had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes until she aged out. The experience had left her pragmatic and fiercely independent, with a dry wit that often caught people off guard. She glanced at Jonah, raised an eyebrow at his position on the ground, and smirked. "Brave or stupid?" she asked lightly, nodding toward Ash. Jonah gave a small, humorless smile. "Little of both." Nina set the bucket down just outside the fence, careful not to get too close. "Feed's there if he wants it. He usually doesn't." She hesitated, then added, her voice softer, "Don't take it personal if he doesn't come around. Some of them never do." Jonah nodded but said nothing. Words felt clumsy in the face of what was unfolding here. Nina gave Rusty a quick scratch behind the ears before heading back toward the barn, her boots kicking up small puffs of dust. Jonah remained, the morning stretching thin around him. Minutes passed, or maybe it was an hour. Time had a way of unraveling out here, like the frayed end of a rope left to the mercy of the wind. Ash circled the far edge of the pen once, hooves stirring the dirt into lazy spirals, before stopping again to fix Jonah with that same unreadable gaze. Jonah shifted only slightly, settling deeper into the dust. He found himself murmuring under his breath, not words of comfort, not coaxing, just a soft litany of nonsense, the way he used to speak to Rusty when they were pinned down during missions, when the darkness grew too heavy to bear. Rusty yawned and laid his head on Jonah's knee, a warm, steady pressure. The world shrank down to the three of them, man, dog, horse, and the brittle wind that sang of ancient sorrow. As the light began to change, slanting sharper through the cloud cover, Jonah caught the briefest flicker of something in Ash's posture, a twitch of an ear, a subtle shift of weight, a momentary stillness that wasn't laden with aggression. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply breathed, slow and even, and let the distance between them thrum like a taut wire. Ash didn't come closer. Not today, but he didn't retreat either. And for Jonah, who understood that survival often meant enduring the unbearable, that was enough. As the sky bruised deeper into evening and the first cool drops of rain began to patter against the dry earth, Jonah stood at last, brushing dust from his jeans. Rusty rose with him, stretching with a grunt. Jonah gave Ash one last look, a look that wasn't a challenge, nor an invitation. It was simply acknowledgement. Without a word, he turned and walked away, the old boards of the walkway creaking under his boots. Behind him, the stallion remained still, watching, the storm of his spirit momentarily at rest. Tomorrow was another day. Maybe tomorrow, the distance between them would shrink again. The days at Whispering Pines unfolded like threads unwinding from a loom, slow, deliberate, easy to miss if one wasn't paying attention. By the third morning, the chill of early fall had deepened, and the golden light slanting across the pastures seemed thicker, almost syrupy. The ranch was a symphony of quiet rhythms, horses whickering in the paddocks, the metallic clink of water troughs being refilled, the low murmur of the wind through the ponderosa pines. Jonah McCrae had fallen into his own rhythm too. Every afternoon after the feedings and mucking were done, he would head to Ash's enclosure, the same old wooden stool slung under one arm, a dog-eared book tucked under the other. He didn't call it a plan, because plans implied expectations, and expectations were a dangerous thing out here. Ash had changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly to anyone but Jonah and maybe Rusty, who trotted alongside his master with the casual alertness of an old soldier. The stallion no longer pinned his ears flat against his skull when Jonah approached. He didn't lunge at the panels or rear in silent fury. Instead, Ash watched, wary but still, breathing slow and deep like some primal rhythm of survival. Jonah would sit, sometimes flipping open an old horse training manual he found in Henry's cluttered office. The book, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age, was full of notes scrawled in the margins. Henry's handwriting, neat and decisive. Jonah rarely read more than a few paragraphs before letting the book rest on his knee. Rusty would settle at his feet, head draped lazily across Jonah's boot, his breathing a steady whisper against the dusty floorboards. Some afternoons, Emmett Price would wander by under the guise of checking fences. Emmett was the ranch's farrier, a towering man in his late 50s, built like a weathered oak, his hands as big as dinner plates and just as scarred. His beard was a tangled mess of gray and black, and his voice had the rough edge of gravel dragged over stone. Emmett had worked with horses longer than anyone else at Whispering Pines, and though he rarely spoke, his presence was oddly reassuring. "You're doing it right," Emmett said one afternoon, leaning heavily on the fence rail, a battered cowboy hat pulled low over his brow. His voice was low, meant not to startle the horses. Most folks don't have the patience. They come at a horse with noise and ropes and expect miracles. Jonah glanced up, shading his eyes against the afternoon glare. "Feels like I'm doing nothing." Emmett chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Sometimes nothing's the only language they understand. Ash flicked an ear toward Emmett but otherwise remained still. Jonah nodded slightly, returning his gaze to the horse. The silence stretched out again, comfortable and vast. Each day, Ash crept closer. Not in grand gestures, no dramatic charges or nose nudges, but in small, tentative shifts. One day, he lingered halfway across the pen instead of retreating to the farthest corner. Another, he dropped his head slightly, an instinctive sign of relaxation among horses. Jonah said nothing. He simply breathed, slow and measured, letting the silence fill the space between them, like a bridge under construction. Nina Brooks observed this slow dance from afar, often while stacking hay or mending torn blankets in the barn. Her sharp green eyes missed little. Once, as Jonah left the paddock after a particularly quiet session, she tossed him a battered paperback novel. The Man Who Listens to Horses by Monty Roberts. Figured you'd appreciate it, she said with a crooked grin, her tattooed arms dusted with straw. You're halfway there already. Jonah accepted the book without comment, but read it in the dim light of his small room above the tack room, Rusty curled against his side like a breathing pillow. He learned, too, by listening to Henry and Clara talk in the evenings, their conversations carried on the porch over mugs of black coffee. Whispering Pines was not a place of formal lessons. It taught by immersion, through wind and earth, through the patience of animals that had seen too much cruelty to trust easily. One evening, as the sun melted into a pool of fire behind the hills, Jonah found himself reading aloud from his old horse manual, more for his own benefit than Ash's. His voice was low, almost monotone, reciting lines about body language, trust signals, and patience. Ash stood just a few yards away, ears flicked forward, watching. Rusty, sprawled bonelessly at Jonah's feet, lifted his head at a particularly sharp gust of wind that sent tumbleweeds rolling across the paddocks. The dog's tail thumped once against Jonah's boot before settling again. The world beyond Whispering Pines still spun its mad, chaotic dance. Sirens in the city, screaming news feeds, endless noise. But here, time stretched and stilled, like a sheet pulled taut over a bed of secrets. One late afternoon, Clara approached while Jonah was settled into his familiar vigil. She carried a clipboard and a half-eaten apple, her work boots scuffing softly against the dusty ground. She wore a navy blue jacket patched at the elbows and her short black hair was tucked under a faded ball cap. "Heard you're the Ash Whisperer now," Clara teased lightly, her smile a rare flash of warmth. Jonah shook his head. "Not whispering. Just sitting." Clara leaned against the fence, arms crossed. "Sometimes that's enough. You know, horses aren't much different from people. Push 'em too hard, too fast, they break. Let 'em breathe, and sometimes they come back stronger." She tossed the apple core into a trash barrel and adjusted the radio clip to her belt. Soft country music buzzed faintly from its speaker, a slow, mournful ballad about lost roads and second chances. Jonah said nothing. He didn't need to. The look Clara gave him, one survivor to another, said everything. As the shadows deepened and the coolness of evening crept over the ranch, Ash took another small step. He moved closer to the center of the pen, his breath ghosting in the chill air, muscles loose and unguarded for the first time since Jonah had arrived. Jonah caught the motion out of the corner of his eye, but didn't turn. He let it happen on its own terms. The language of silence was slow, painfully so. But it was honest. And for souls like Jonah's and Ash's, battered by storms others couldn't see, it was the only language that ever truly mattered. The day began deceptively calm at Whispering Pines, with skies stretched wide and brittle blue over the rolling pastures. But by late afternoon, the air had thickened, heavy and electric, making the hair on the back of Jonah McCrae's neck stand on end. Somewhere beyond the distant foothills, thunder grumbled like a waking giant. Henry McCrae stood on the porch of the main house, squinting at the horizon, his weathered face drawn tight with unease. Clara Mendoza leaned against a post nearby, arms crossed, her dark eyes narrowed at the boiling clouds. Even Emmett Price, the stoic farrier, paused his work shoeing a chestnut mare to glance skyward, his massive hands tightening reflexively around his tools. "You'll want to make sure the gates are double-latched," Henry called to Jonah, his voice cutting through the rising wind. "Storm's gonna come in fast." Jonah nodded, already heading toward the pens. Rusty, his faithful Belgian Malinois, trotted at his heels, hackles half raised as if he too sensed the coming violence in the air. The first fat drops of rain splattered the dust as Jonah reached Ash's enclosure. The Mustang stood near the far fence, head high, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the changing wind. His muscles quivered beneath his silver smoke coat, the tension in his body rising with the darkening sky. A sudden crack of thunder ripped across the valley, and Ash lunged, slamming his chest against the sturdy fence. Jonah flinched instinctively, heart thudding. Rusty let out a low, uneasy growl, his body pressing closer to Jonah's side. The storm broke in earnest then, sheets of rain cascading down, lightning forking across the clouds like cracks in black glass. The world became a chaos of sound and light. Ash was losing himself. The stallion reared violently, slamming his hooves into the wood and steel, eyes wide and white-rimmed with terror. He battered the walls, each impact sending shudders through the ground. His screams, high and raw, split the roar of the rain, the kind of sound Jonah had only ever heard in combat, the sound of a creature convinced death was closing in. Without thinking, Jonah dropped the latch and slipped into the pen. Behind him, Rusty barked sharply but didn't follow, as if even the loyal dog understood that this was something his master had to face alone. Inside the pen, Jonah moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his posture low and his movements wide and unthreatening. His boots squelched in the mud. Ash pivoted toward him, wild-eyed, hooves striking the ground hard enough to splatter mud halfway up Jonah's legs. Jonah's chest tightened painfully, the familiar rush of adrenaline battling against the whisper of logic telling him to run. But he stayed. When the next flash of lightning lit the pen like a prison yard, Jonah did the only thing he could think of. He started to sing. The song was old, almost forgotten, a rough soldier's ballad from long marches and night watches. His voice cracked on the first few words, too soft to rise above the thunder at first. But he kept singing, forcing the melody out, low and steady, like laying a bridge plank by plank across a chasm. This is the place I call my own, where bullets fly and men don't moan. Ash flinched again as another boom rattled the sky, but he didn't bolt. His ears twitched toward Jonah, confusion flickering in his storm-bright eyes. Jonah kept singing, voice hoarse but unwavering, threading his words into the gale. Outside the enclosure, Rusty let out a mournful howl, a sound both heartbreaking and strangely anchoring. Jonah caught the flash of Clara and Henry in the distance, standing frozen under the shelter of the barn, watching but not interfering. They knew the stakes. Ash's breathing was ragged, steam rising from his flanks in the cold rain. His body remained coiled with tension, but the frantic rearing slowed. He shifted his weight, hoofing the ground anxiously, but no longer slamming the walls. Jonah stayed rooted where he was, hands at his sides, voice carrying another verse over the hammering rain. Slowly, agonizingly, Ash lowered his head a fraction. The next flash of lightning illuminated them both, man and horse soaked to the bone, surrounded by mud and fear and the ghosts of things neither could name aloud. And then, with a shudder that rippled through his entire frame, Ash took a single step forward. Jonah froze, not daring to even breathe. Another step. A tremble in the legs, the faintest twitch in the battered ears. Ash's muzzle, wet and quivering, stretched toward Jonah. His nostrils flared as he inhaled the scent of sweat, rain, and something deeper. Something old and familiar and broken in exactly the same way. The touch, when it came, was feather-light, the soft, trembling press of velvet flesh against Jonah's knuckles. It lasted only a heartbeat, but it was enough to shatter every wall Jonah had built inside himself. He closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over them both. In that fragile moment, man and horse stood together, not as prisoner and captor, but as survivors, two battered spirits who had, against every odd, chosen to trust. The storm raged around them, a cacophony of thunder and flashing fury. But within the small circle of mud and breath and broken songs, there was a stillness so profound it felt like the first true silence Jonah had known in years. When Ash finally stepped back, it wasn't a retreat, it was a choice. A silent promise that the bridge between them would hold, storm or no. Jonah exhaled a shaky breath and without a word backed toward the gate, never turning his back, never breaking the sacred thread that now linked them. Rusty was there waiting, soaked and shivering but alert, his amber eyes full of something close to pride. As Jonah latched the gate again and turned toward the barn, he felt the bruised weight of the world pressing a little less heavily on his shoulders. Behind him, Ash watched from the center of the pen, the wildfire in his eyes banked but not extinguished, a flame that might, given time and patience, burn warm instead of cold. For the first time, as the last rumbles of the storm rolled away into the mountains, Jonah allowed himself to believe. Healing was not a battlefield to be conquered. It was a long, muddy road, and he wasn't walking it alone anymore. The morning sky over Boise, Idaho, was a deep, endless blue, the kind that seemed to promise hope and danger in equal measure. The fairgrounds buzzed with early excitement as trailers rattled in, setting up booths decked in fluttering banners, and the sweet scent of roasting kettle corn drifted on the breeze. Jonah McCrae shifted uneasily in the front seat of Henry's battered Ford truck, his thumb tapping a nervous rhythm against the steering wheel. Rusty sat in the back seat, nose pressed against the window, his ears flicking back and forth with the hyper-awareness of an old soldier in unfamiliar territory. Beside Jonah in the passenger seat, Clara Mendoza checked the final registration papers. Dressed in a worn denim jacket and dark jeans, her usual calm demeanor was intact. Though Jonah noticed the way she kept glancing at the fairground crowds already gathering beyond the parking lot fence. Clara was a quiet sort, but she hated chaos. Large, noisy crowds reminded her too much of evacuation centers during wildfire seasons of her youth. The tense, overcrowded shelters, the smell of panic thick as smoke. "Relax," Clara said without looking up. "We're not here to win ribbons. Just show the world what trust looks like." Jonah nodded mutely, his stomach tight with apprehension. It wasn't just the crowd that unsettled him. It was the weight of what he was about to ask Ash to endure. The trailer behind them shifted slightly as Ash moved within. The Mustang had traveled quietly, much to everyone's surprise, standing steady through the rumble of the freeway and the jostle of traffic. Jonah had sat in the back seat for most of the drive, murmuring old army songs under his breath, a low, constant reassurance. They had been invited to the Idaho State Fair's Freedom Showcase, a new event designed to highlight the bonds between rescue animals and veterans. Henry had hesitated when the invitation first arrived, but Jonah had surprised them all by agreeing almost immediately. "I think we're ready," he had said simply, and no one had dared to question it. The staging area behind the main arena buzzed with movement. Handlers leading shining horses, ponies adorned with bright ribbons, rodeo riders adjusting tack. Ash drew eyes the moment Jonah lowered the trailer ramp. The Mustang stepped down slowly, his silver smoke coat gleaming under the late afternoon sun. His head lifted high, nostrils flaring as he drank in the smells and sounds of this strange, crowded world. Yet he didn't spook. His eyes, that old battle-scarred gaze, found Jonah immediately and steadied. Nearby, a woman in a bright red jacket paused to stare at them. She was tall and angular, her black hair braided down her back. Marla Jensen, the event's volunteer coordinator, had a sharp, hawk-like gaze that missed nothing. A former police officer who had transitioned into animal therapy work after a spinal injury, Marla carried herself with the rigid, clipped movements of someone who had learned to manage constant pain. She approached with a clipboard tucked under one arm. "You must be Jonah McCrae," she said briskly, sticking out a firm hand. "And this must be the famous Ash." Jonah shook her hand, noting the strength in her grip despite the brace that peeked from under her jacket sleeve. "We've got you slated for the finale slot," Marla continued, glancing at her clipboard. "No pressure, just a few hundred people watching." She smiled dryly, but Jonah sensed the underlying seriousness. "It's important they see this. See him." Jonah nodded, feeling Ash shift slightly beside him, brushing against his shoulder in a quiet reassurance of his own. Hours later, as the late sun bled gold across the horizon, they waited by the arena gates. The crowd inside was massive, packed shoulder to shoulder along the bleachers, the hum of voices blending with the shrill laughter of children and the occasional boom of a distant loudspeaker announcing winners of pie-eating contests or 4-H competitions. Music blared from the carnival rides across the fairgrounds, a pulsing, chaotic rhythm. Rusty sat obediently at Clara's feet near the entrance, eyes locked on Jonah and Ash, his body tense but ready. When their name was finally called, Jonah swallowed against the knot in his throat and led Ash forward. No halter, no lead rope, just a man and a horse stepping into an open, noisy world. The stadium seemed to suck in its breath. Jonah moved slowly, boots stirring dust from the packed earth, his hands relaxed at his sides. Ash followed, head lowered but alert, his hooves making no more sound than whispers against the ground. Each step was deliberate. The noise swelled. A child shrieked near the front, a burst of laughter from the beer garden, but Ash stayed with him. Jonah used nothing but body language, a slight tilt of his shoulders to guide the Mustang into a wide circle, a subtle shift in weight to invite him to change direction. Ash obeyed without hesitation, moving like smoke across the arena. The audience sat frozen, as if afraid the slightest noise would break the fragile, spellbound connection between man and horse. Jonah felt the sweat bead at his temples, but he kept his focus narrow, centered entirely on the living being at his side. As the last of the sunlight caught Ash's coat, the Mustang shimmered like molten silver, every line of his scarred body illuminated, not hidden. Jonah took a step backward. Ash stopped instantly, his ears flicking forward, waiting. Jonah knelt in the dust. Ash walked to him. He dropped his muzzle gently against Jonah's bent head, a soft, astonishing gesture of trust that needed no translation. The crowd erupted, a tidal wave of applause and cheers that crashed around them. Jonah stayed kneeling for a long moment, feeling Ash's breath warm against his skin, his own heart thundering in his chest, for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. When he finally rose, he rested a hand against Ash's strong neck, and together they made a slow, steady walk toward the gate, leaving behind a stadium filled with people who had witnessed something that felt bigger than a performance. It felt like a resurrection. Back in the staging area, Marla Jensen met them with tears brimming in her fierce eyes. "That," she said hoarsely, "is what hope looks like." Jonah simply smiled, the first real smile that had touched his face in what felt like years. The triumph at the Idaho State Fair seemed to hang in the air around Whispering Pines like the sweet perfume of rain after a long drought. For a few days, there was only celebration, volunteers smiling wider, Clara humming while she swept the barn aisles, Henry whistling under his breath as he repaired an old saddle. Jonah McCrae should have been happy, but a quiet unease gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had learned long ago that peace was never free. The first signs of trouble came, wrapped in polite smiles and stiff handshakes. Thomas Reed, a stocky man in his 50s, owner of the largest cattle operation bordering Whispering Pines, pulled up in a dust-choked Ford and unfolded himself from the cab with a grunt. He wore a brown felt hat and a pressed flannel shirt tucked neatly into his jeans, but there was nothing soft about the set of his jaw or the way he approached the fence line. Henry McCrae met him halfway, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Morning, Thomas," Henry said evenly. Thomas nodded curtly. His pale gray eyes flicked toward the paddocks where Ash grazed quietly near the fence, a faint sheen of sunlight gilding his silver smoke coat. "Henry," Thomas began, his voice low but firm, "word spread about that Mustang of yours." He paused, the wind stirring the dust around their boots. "Folks are uneasy. Got half a mind to start a petition. If that horse snaps, hurts someone, who's liable?" Henry's mouth tightened, but he said nothing. Thomas pressed the point. "You're good people, Henry, but good intentions don't stop lawsuits." He tipped his hat back slightly, revealing deep worry lines etched into his forehead. "I ain't saying the boy's not doing a fine job with him, but some of us got families. Kids, we can't take the risk." Behind the safety of the barn wall, Jonah stood listening, fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Rusty, ever attuned to his moods, leaned against his leg with a low, reassuring grunt. It wasn't just Thomas. Within days, anonymous letters began slipping into the ranch's mailbox, some cautious, others outright hostile. A few local newspapers ran opinion columns questioning whether Whispering Pines was endangering the community by harboring a dangerous animal. One reporter even published an article ominously titled, "When Second Chances Turn Deadly." The financial strain hit almost immediately. Several donors who had previously supported Whispering Pines with modest monthly gifts withdrew, citing concerns about public image. One night, Jonah found Henry sitting alone in the kitchen, the ledger book open in front of him, his broad shoulders hunched under the weight of figures that refused to balance. The overhead light cast deep shadows into the lines of the old man's face, making him look every one of his 70 years. "We're bleeding, son," Henry said quietly, not looking up. "Between the feed bills, the vet costs, and now the bad press, I don't know how much longer we can keep the place running like this." Jonah sat heavily across from him, heart sinking. "There has to be a way." Henry gave a tired smile, one part pride, two parts sorrow. "There's always a way. Question is what it'll cost." That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He lay awake in the cramped bunk above the tack room. Rusty sprawled across the floorboards below. The ceiling creaked with the shifting of the old house, the wind rattled the loose window pane, and his mind spun in relentless circles. Was he selfish, asking Ash to stay here? Was he endangering everything Henry had built? Everything the other horses and the veterans depended on? just because he couldn't bear to let go? Around 3 a.m., unable to stand it any longer, Jonah padded down to the paddocks. The night air was cool and sharp, stars strewn across the black vault above like shattered glass. Ash stood at the far end of his enclosure, silhouetted against the faint silver glow of the moon. When he saw Jonah, he lifted his head and walked forward with easy, fluid grace. The Mustang stopped a few feet away, watching Jonah with those pale, knowing eyes. Jonah sank into the grass outside the fence and rested his forehead against the cool wood. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," he whispered. Ash snorted softly, a warm plume of breath rising into the night air. He stretched his neck over the fence and bumped Jonah's shoulder lightly with his muzzle. No judgment, no answers, just presence. Jonah closed his eyes against the sudden sting of tears. The next morning brought unexpected news. A letter arrived, crisp and official, bearing the seal of the Mustang Horizons Foundation, a major national nonprofit dedicated to rescuing and rehabilitating wild horses. Along with it came another letter from the Valor Path Alliance, a veterans advocacy group known for supporting non-traditional therapy programs. Both organizations had heard about Jonah and Ash's demonstration at the fair, and about the controversy swirling around Whispering Pines. They weren't deterred. In fact, they wanted to help. The proposals were simple, but staggering. Substantial grants, earmarked for the expansion of Whispering Pines into a dual-purpose healing center. A sanctuary where traumatized horses and wounded veterans could recover side by side. They envisioned new paddocks, a therapy garden, modest cabins for live-in veteran participants, and educational programs to train other sanctuaries in this model. All Henry and Jonah had to do was say yes. At the dining table that evening, the documents spread out before them like a map to some half-imagined future. Jonah met Henry's gaze across the worn wood. "We'd have to grow," Henry said. "Take on staff, open the ranch to more people." His voice was cautious but tinged with hope. Jonah nodded, heart pounding. "We'd also have to be ready for more scrutiny, more risks." Henry smiled slightly. "That's what trust is, son. It's always a gamble." Outside, in the falling twilight, Ash galloped the length of his enclosure, his silver smoke coat catching the last of the sun's fire. Watching him, Jonah knew there was no other choice. Healing, for both man and beast, was not a destination. It was a journey. And this ranch, bruised but still standing, would be the road they traveled together. The sun rose over Whispering Pines like a great copper coin, spilling molten light across the dewy fields and fresh-built cabins that dotted the once quiet ranch. The changes had been swift but thoughtful. New paddocks stretched across the rolling land, wide and open to preserve the spirit of the wild horses that now called this place home. The therapy gardens, planted with lavender, wild sage, and bursts of golden yarrow, buzzed with bees and the gentle shuffle of veterans tending their plots with slow, careful hands. At the heart of it all stood Jonah McCrae, leaning against the newly carved cedar sign that read, "Whispering Pines, Land of Mending Souls." His roughened fingers traced the grooves of the letters almost reverently. It felt both strange and right, this new chapter, born from so much old pain. Ash grazed lazily a few yards away, his silver smoke coat gleaming under the morning light. The once feral Mustang moved with an easy confidence now, his body still scarred, but no longer rigid with distrust. Veterans and volunteers alike looked to him as something more than just a horse. He had become a symbol, proof that even the most wounded spirits could find their way back. Rusty, grayer around the muzzle but no less spry, darted between the fence posts, chasing shadows and stirring up clouds of butterflies that rose in bright bursts. Jonah pulled in a deep breath, the clean scent of pine and horse sweat filling his lungs. It was time. The idea had simmered quietly for weeks, ever since the grants were secured and the center was dedicated. Jonah had waited for a sign, a feeling that the moment was right. Now, with the ranch alive with laughter, the fields thick with wildflowers, and the wind whispering sweet songs across the hills, he knew. Today, he would ride Ash for the first time. He walked slowly to the main paddock, where Ash lifted his head at his approach. The Mustang's ears flicked forward and a soft nicker rumbled from his chest. Jonah smiled and extended a hand, palm open. Ash stepped forward willingly, brushing his muzzle against Jonah's fingers. No halter, no rope. He didn't need them. Nearby, Clara Mendoza leaned against the new wooden fence, arms crossed, a slow smile curving her mouth. Her dark hair was tucked under a ball cap embroidered with the ranch's new logo, a silhouette of a horse and a soldier under a vast pine tree. She said nothing, but her presence was a solid weight of support. Emmett Price stood farther off, a heavy-set figure in a wide-brimmed hat, pretending to check the gate hinges, but glancing up now and then with a gleam of interest in his sharp eyes. Even Sarah Nolan, a fresh volunteer from Seattle, a tall, willowy woman in her late 20s with short blonde curls and a naturally gentle touch, paused her work stacking hay to watch. Sarah was new to ranch life, having fled a high-stress city job after suffering crippling burnout. Soft-spoken but observant, she had an innate kindness that animals picked up on immediately. Jonah had seen how even the most jittery foals leaned into her touch, and how veterans who barely spoke seemed to relax when she was near. Jonah turned his attention back to Ash. Slowly, he placed the light bareback pad on the Mustang's broad back, fastening the girth with steady hands. Ash flicked an ear but didn't move away. Jonah climbed the old mounting block, heart hammering against his ribs. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him. Was he asking too much? But Ash shifted slightly, aligning his body to offer easier access, and the question faded. Carefully, Jonah swung one leg over and settled lightly onto Ash's back. The world seemed to hold its breath. Ash tensed for a heartbeat, the old instincts rising, but then he relaxed under Jonah's steady weight, his muscles bunching and releasing in smooth rhythm. Jonah sat still, letting his own breathing match Ash's, one breath, then another. Rusty gave an excited bark from below and trotted alongside as Jonah gave a gentle nudge with his heels. Ash stepped forward, slow and sure. Together, they moved out of the paddock, through the fields bursting with yellow primroses and purple lupine, the scents of the wildflowers weaving a dizzying tapestry in the warming air. They headed toward the hill behind the ranch, the one Jonah had often stared at during sleepless nights, wondering if he would ever find the strength to climb it. Clara and the others watched silently as horse, man, and dog made their slow, steady ascent. The path was uneven, strewn with loose stones and tufts of grass. Ash handled it with the sure-footed grace of a creature who had once roamed the wild mountains. Jonah kept his hands light, his posture loose, trusting Ash to find the way. At the summit, the world opened up. From that height, Jonah could see the entire ranch spread below. The paddocks dotted with Mustangs, the therapy garden shimmering green and gold, the small cabins clustered like a village built from hope. He could see Sarah laughing with a newly arrived veteran as they wrestled a stubborn wheelbarrow. He could see Henry and Emmett working to hang a new wind chime on the barn porch. He could see Clara watching him, hands on her hips, smiling against the morning sun. Rusty flopped down at Ash's hooves, tongue lolling happily, his sides heaving with exertion, but his eyes bright with pride. Jonah leaned forward slightly, resting his forehead against Ash's warm neck. The Mustang shifted his weight, snorting softly, and Jonah felt the deep, steady heartbeat beneath the scarred skin. It was more than a ride. It was a homecoming. It was freedom, real and raw and breathtaking. The wind picked up, singing through the pines below, carrying with it the scent of rain and dust and blooming life. Jonah lifted his head and let the song wash over him, a melody of healing, of second chances seized and held tight. In that moment, with the wide sky above and the resilient earth beneath, Jonah understood that healing didn't mean forgetting the pain. It meant riding forward anyway, scars and all, into a future built not on fear, but on faith. Ash tossed his head once, the sun catching in his mane like a crown. Jonah laughed, a free, clear sound he hadn't heard from his own lips in years, and nudged Ash into a lope. They raced the wind down the hill, Rusty bounding after them, and the world itself seemed to open its arms and run alongside them, wild and unbroken and gloriously alive. In a world often full of broken dreams and silent struggles, sometimes the greatest miracles come quietly. They do not always arrive with flashing lights or thunder from the heavens. Sometimes they are stitched together slowly, through patience, through love, through the willingness to trust again after everything inside tells us to run. Ash and Jonah's story reminds us that no soul is ever too broken for God's healing hands. When we open our hearts, Even just a little, when we dare to believe that healing is possible, God meets us there. In the fields of our everyday lives, through the hands of others, through moments of unexpected grace, His miracles unfold. Maybe you are carrying burdens unseen by the world. Maybe you feel like hope is far away. I want you to remember today that you are not forgotten. Like the scarred Mustang finding his way back to trust, and like the weary veteran finding his way back to life, God's love is patient, steady, and unstoppable. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a reminder that second chances are real. Leave a comment to tell us your thoughts, and if you feel called, write Amen in the comments as a prayer for all the broken hearts still searching for their own healing. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of hope, love, and the quiet miracles God weaves into our everyday lives. Let us continue to pray for each other, and may God bless you abundantly on your journey.